The blood on Willa Daniels' hands was not her own, but the town of Fort Benton, Montana Territory, would never forgive her for it anyway. She scrubbed her fingers raw in the creek that ran behind her small cabin, watching the red swirl away into the current as the October sun dipped lower on the horizon. 3 days had passed since she saved Samuel Porter's life using methods the church-going folk deemed unholy, and already she could feel the noose of judgment tightening around her neck. They whispered about her in the streets now, crossing themselves when she passed, pulling their children close as though her very presence might corrupt their innocent souls. The fact that Samuel breathed, walked, and spoke did not matter. The fact that he would have died without her intervention meant nothing. She had used herbs the local doctor did not recognize, had chanted words in a language her grandmother taught her, had laid her hands upon his fevered body and drawn the poison out through means they called witchcraft. The year was 1882, and progress had brought railroads and telegraph wires to Montana Territory, but it had not brought open minds. Willa had known this truth her entire 23 years, had felt it in the suspicious glances thrown her way since childhood, had tasted it in the bitter tea of isolation she drank each morning. Her grandmother had been a healer too, learning her craft from the native peoples who once roamed these lands freely, blending their wisdom with remedies brought from the old country. When grandmother Rose passed 2 winters ago, she left Willa alone in a world that feared what it could not understand. The cabin sat at the edge of town, far enough from respectable society that her presence would not offend, close enough that desperate souls could find her when conventional medicine failed. And they did come, slinking through the darkness like sinners to confession, begging for her help when their children burned with fever or their wounds festered beyond the doctor's ability to heal. She never turned anyone away, never asked for more than they could afford, and in return she received their shame-faced gratitude and their public rejection. Willa dried her hands on her worn apron and stood, her knees protesting from kneeling too long on the rocky bank. The air carried the first bite of winter, promising snow before November arrived. She needed to gather more supplies before the ground froze, needed to prepare tinctures and salves that would last through the harsh Montana winter when travel became impossible. The forest beyond Fort Benton held what she needed, the same forest where the town buried their discomfort by pretending she did not exist. She was gathering her basket and her grandmother's old herb knife when she heard the horse approaching. The hoofbeats were unsteady, the rider clearly struggling to maintain control. Willa stepped out from behind her cabin just as a large bay horse stumbled to a halt in her yard, its rider slumped forward over the saddle horn. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and bleeding. Even unconscious, he held himself with a certain bearing that spoke of strength and capability. His dark hair fell across his face, obscuring his features, but Willa could see the spreading crimson stain on his left side, could smell the sharp tang of blood and gunpowder. His clothes marked him as a working man, a cowboy by the look of his worn leather chaps and the rope coiled at his saddle. "Steady now," she murmured, approaching the horse carefully. The animal was well trained despite its distress, standing still as Willa reached up to assess its rider. The man was burning with fever, his skin hot to the touch, his breathing shallow and labored. She could see the bullet wound now, a nasty thing just below his ribs, and from the smell of it, the bullet was still lodged inside. Getting him down from the horse and into her cabin took all of Willa's strength, and several minutes of careful maneuvering. He was heavy with muscle and unconsciousness, a dead weight that nearly toppled her twice before she managed to drag him through her door and onto the narrow bed where she treated her patients. His horse, bless its loyal heart, followed them inside when she beckoned, too well trained to leave its master even in such strange circumstances. She settled the animal in the corner with water and the oats she kept for emergencies, then turned her full attention to the dying man. Because he was dying, she could see that clearly now in the candlelight. The wound was infected, the flesh around it angry and swollen, the smell of rot just beginning to take hold. He had been shot at least 2 days ago, maybe 3, and had been riding through it all, pushing his body beyond what any mortal frame should endure. Whatever had driven him to her door, it had not been chance. Men did not stumble upon Willa Daniels by accident. They came because they had nowhere else to go. She worked through the night, her hands steady even as her mind raced through the procedures her grandmother had taught her. First, she cut away his shirt, revealing a torso mapped with old scars, each one telling a story of violence survived. Then she cleaned the wound with whiskey and hot water, probing gently until she found the bullet lodged against bone. The extraction required all her skill, and several of her grandmother's prayers muttered in the old tongue. But finally, the misshapen piece of lead came free, clattering into her metal basin with a sound like judgment deferred. But removing the bullet was only the beginning. The infection had taken hold, spreading its poison through his blood, and conventional medicine would say he was beyond saving. Willa had learned long ago that conventional medicine understood only a fraction of what the body could endure and overcome. She prepared a poultice from yarrow and plantain, from comfrey root and herbs whose names existed only in her grandmother's language. She made a tea from willow bark and elderberry, forcing small amounts between his cracked lips. Then she laid her hands upon his chest and felt for the sickness inside him. This was the part that frightened people, the part they called unnatural. Willa felt the heat of the infection like a living thing beneath her palms, felt its tendrils spreading through his body, choking the life from him bit by bit. She pulled at it, drawing it toward her, away from his vital organs, away from his heart. The effort left her gasping, sweat running down her face despite the October chill. But slowly, impossibly, she felt his fever begin to break. Dawn found her slumped beside the bed, exhausted but cautiously optimistic. The man still slept, but his breathing had deepened, his color improved from deathly gray to merely pale. She had done all she could. Now it was up to his body to decide whether to fight or surrender. Willa dozed fitfully in her chair, jerking awake at every sound, checking his pulse and temperature with mechanical regularity. She changed his bandages, tended to his horse, and tried not to think about the consequences of harboring a wounded man in her home. If the town discovered him here, they would assume the worst. They would say she had lured him, bewitched him, perhaps even shot him herself. Their fear of her had been building for years, and it would take very little to turn that fear into something dangerous. The man opened his eyes as the sun reached its zenith on the second day. They were striking eyes, green as new grass, and they fixed on her face with an intensity that made her catch her breath. For a long moment he simply stared, his expression moving from confusion to comprehension to something that might have been wonder. "You are alive," Willa said, keeping her voice gentle. "You were shot. Do you remember?" He tried to speak, his throat too dry for words. She brought water, helping him drink slowly, her hand supporting his head. He had a strong jaw, she noticed, and a scar through his left eyebrow that gave him a roguish appearance even in his weakened state. "How long?" He managed finally, his voice rough as gravel. 2 days since you arrived." "How long since you were shot? I cannot say for certain, but at least 3 days, maybe 4. You are very lucky to be alive." "Lucky," he repeated, and something like bitter humor touched his face. "Rakan, that is not the word I would use." He tried to sit up, gasped, and fell back against the pillows, his face going white with pain. "Do not move yet," Willa commanded, her healer's authority overriding any deference she might normally show a stranger. "The wound is clean, but you lost a great deal of blood, and the infection nearly killed you. Your body needs rest." He studied her again, those green eyes missing nothing despite his weakness. "You are the healer, the one they talk about in town." It was not a question, but she nodded anyway. "I am Willa Daniels, and you are in my cabin on the outskirts of Fort Benton. Your horse brought you here." "Good boy," the man muttered, glancing toward where his bay stood dozing in the corner. "Always had more sense than me." He looked back at Willa, and his expression grew serious. "They say you use witchcraft." She had learned long ago not to flinch from the accusation. "They say many things about me, few of them kind. Does it matter to you how you were saved or only that you were?" For a moment, he seemed to consider this, his eyes never leaving her face. Then, slowly, deliberately, he said, "I was dying. I felt death riding beside me every mile of the way here, felt it waiting for me to slip from the saddle so it could claim what was owed. I made it here because my horse knew the way, because some part of me refused to quit even when quitting would have been easier. And you pulled me back from whatever edge I was hanging over. So no, Miss Daniels, it does not matter to me one bit what they call your methods. Your ways saved me, and that is all I need to know." Something in Willa's chest loosened at his words, some knot of tension she had carried for so long she had forgotten it was there. When was the last time someone had thanked her without shame, had acknowledged her skill without fear? "You should rest," she said softly. "We can talk more when you are stronger. Wait." His hand moved, catching hers before she could step away. His grip was weak but insistent. "My name. I should tell you my name. That can wait too." "No." He held her gaze, and she saw something in those green eyes that spoke of honor and determination. "If I am going to owe you my life, you should know whose life you saved. I am Yates Lawson, and I promise you, Miss Daniels, whatever trouble comes from my being here, I will not let it fall on you." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep inside her, something she had locked away years ago when she accepted that her path would be walked alone. She gently extracted her hand from his, ignoring the way her skin tingled where they had touched. "Rest, Mr. Lawson," she said again. "We will worry about trouble when it comes." But trouble, as it turned out, was already on its way. Willa discovered this the next morning when she went to town for supplies. She had left Yates sleeping peacefully, his fever gone, his body finally beginning to heal, and had hoped to slip in and out of Fort Benton before anyone paid her much mind. Instead, she found the town buzzing like a disturbed hornet's nest, groups of men clustered outside the saloon, their voices carrying in the crisp morning air. "3 banks in as many months," one man was saying as Willa passed. "The Lawson gang is getting bolder." She froze, her basket suddenly heavy on her arm. "I heard they killed a man in Miles City last week," another voice added. "Shot him down when he tried to be a hero. The marshal is posting a reward, $500 for information leading to their capture." Willa moved on before she could hear more, her mind racing. Lawson. The name was too distinctive to be a coincidence. She thought of the man in her cabin, of his scars and his fever-bright eyes, of the way he had looked at her when he said his name. What had she done? What had she brought into her home? She bought her supplies quickly, aware of the stares that followed her through the general store. The shopkeeper took her money without meeting her eyes, and the woman who had been examining fabric at the counter gathered her skirts and left rather than share the space with Willa. It was nothing new, nothing she had not endured 1,000 times before, but today it chafed more than usual. Today she had a wounded outlaw in her bed, and if anyone discovered him, her tenuous existence in Fort Benton would end swiftly and probably violently. When she returned to the cabin, Yates was awake, attempting unsuccessfully to sit up without tearing his stitches. She dropped her basket and hurried to his side, her hands pushing him back down with professional firmness. "Are you trying to kill yourself after I worked so hard to save you?" she demanded. "I need to leave," he said through gritted teeth. "It is not safe for me to be here." "It is certainly not safe for you to be riding anywhere in your condition. You would fall from your horse within a mile and tear open everything I sewed shut. You do not understand. The men who shot me, they are not going to stop looking, and when they find me, anyone with me will be in danger." "The men who shot you," Willa repeated carefully, standing back and crossing her arms. "Would that be the law by any chance? The law that is currently posting rewards for information about the Lawson gang?" The expression that crossed his face was answer enough. He closed his eyes, his jaw clenching. "You heard about that in town. It was difficult not to. Apparently your exploits are the talk of Fort Benton." She kept her voice level, refusing to show the fear that coiled in her stomach. "So tell me, Mr. Lawson, exactly what kind of man have I saved?" He opened his eyes and looked at her, and what she saw there was not the cold stare of a hardened criminal but something far more complicated. Pain, yes, and regret, and a weariness that went soul deep. "The kind who had no choice," he said quietly. "The kind who came home from working cattle in Wyoming to find his family's ranch burned, his father dead, and a banker in Miles City claiming the land for unpaid debts that never existed. The kind who found out that same banker was claiming half the ranches in Montana territory through fraud and violence, foreclosing on families who had worked the land for decades. The kind who decided that if the law would not stop him, someone else would have to." Willa sat down slowly in her chair, studying his face. "So you rob banks?" "I rob one bank. The bank in Miles City, the one that stole my family's land and a dozen others. 3 times now my brothers and I have taken back what was stolen, and 3 times we have given that money to the families it was taken from." His voice hardened. "The man who died was not killed by us. He was killed by the banker's hired guns when he tried to stop them from shooting at fleeing civilians. But the law does not care about the truth when a rich man tells them who to blame." She wanted not to believe him. It would be easier if he were simply a criminal, a man who chose violence and theft for profit or pleasure. But the ring of truth in his words matched the honor she had heard when he promised not to let trouble fall on her, and her grandmother had always told her to trust what her heart knew even when her mind counseled caution. "Your brothers," she said. "Where are they now?" "Hiding, same as me. We split up after the shooting, figured it would be harder to track us that way. They will be worried, but they know I can take care of myself." He tried to smile, but it came out more as a grimace. "Or I could before I took a bullet. Who shot you? The law or the banker's men, does it matter? They are working together either way." He shifted slightly, trying to find a more comfortable position, and Willa saw him bite back a sound of pain. "You should turn me in. $500 would buy you a lot of goodwill in this town." "If I wanted goodwill, I would have stopped healing people years ago," Willa said sharply. "But I will not lie to you, Mr. Lawson. You being here puts me in danger. If they find you in my cabin, they will not ask questions before passing judgment on us both." "I know. That is why I need to leave as soon as I can sit a horse." "You cannot sit a horse. You can barely sit up without going pale." She stood and began preparing a fresh poultice, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind worked through the implications of her next words. You will stay here until you are strong enough to travel without killing yourself, but we will need to be careful. No one can know you are here." Why? The question was simple, but the weight behind it was not. Why would you risk yourself for me? You do not know me. I could be lying about everything. Willa paused, considering her answer carefully. Why was she doing this? Because she believed him. Because his cause resonated with the part of her that had always chafed against injustice. Or because when he looked at her, he saw a healer rather than a witch, saw a woman rather than an outcast. "You said my ways saved you," she finally replied, meeting his eyes. "Maybe I am tired of my ways only mattering when people are desperate enough to overlook their fear. Maybe I believe that if the law and the powerful can ally themselves against the innocent, then the innocent deserve to have someone stand with them too." She brought the poultice to his bedside, her expression softening. "Or maybe I am just a foolish woman who cannot bear to send a man to his death when she has the power to prevent it. Does my reasoning matter, Mr. Lawson, or only that I am willing to help?" His answering smile was genuine this time, transforming his face from merely handsome to something that made her heart stumble in her chest. "I suppose it does not, Miss Daniels, and if you are going to risk your life for me, you should probably call me Yates. Then you should call me Willa." She applied the poultice with gentle efficiency, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened when her fingers brushed his skin. "Now rest. You heal faster when you sleep." Over the following days, a routine developed between them. Willa tended to Yates's wound, which showed remarkable improvement under her care, and helped him regain his strength through carefully measured exercises. He proved to be a model patient, following her instructions without complaint, though she could see the frustration in his eyes when his body refused to cooperate with his will. They talked during those long hours, filling the cabin with words that flowed easier than either had expected. Yates told her about his childhood on the ranch, about learning to ride before he could walk, about working cattle drives from Texas to Montana and back again. He spoke of his two younger brothers, Cole and James, who had followed him into outlawry not for profit but for principle, who shared his belief that some wrongs needed righting even if the law looked the other way. Willa, in turn, shared stories she had never told anyone. She spoke of her grandmother, who had fled persecution in the East only to find similar fear in the West. She described learning the healing arts, memorizing plants and their properties, understanding that medicine was as much about listening to the body as treating the symptoms. She admitted the loneliness of her existence, the weight of being needed but not wanted, valued but not respected. "I used to dream of leaving," she confessed one evening as she changed his bandages. The wound was healing cleanly, the angry redness fading to healthy pink. "Just packing up and moving somewhere no one knew me, somewhere I could start fresh without the shadow of my grandmother's reputation following me." "Why did you not?" Yates asked. He had been watching her work with an intensity that made her self-conscious, as though trying to memorize the precise movements of her hands. "Because people here need me, even if they will not admit it. And because running away does not change who you are, only where you are when people discover it." She secured the fresh bandage and sat back. "I would rather be lonely and useful than lonely and useless. You should not have to choose between the two." His hand reached out, catching hers before she could stand. "You deserve to have both, Willa. You deserve to be valued and wanted not just when someone is desperate enough to overcome their superstition." The earnestness in his voice made something crack open inside her, some protective shell she had built around her heart. "That is a kind thing to say, but kindness does not change reality." "Maybe not," he agreed, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm. "But it can remind us what reality should be, and sometimes that is enough to start changing it. She looked down at their joined hands, at the way his calloused fingers intertwined with hers, and felt the world shift slightly on its axis. This was dangerous, she knew. Dangerous to let herself feel anything for this man, who would leave as soon as he could ride. Dangerous to imagine that his gratitude might be something deeper. Dangerous to hope that she might matter to someone beyond her ability to heal their wounds. But when she looked up and met his eyes, she saw her own dangerous hope reflected back at her, and she could not bring herself to pull away. The knock at her door 3 nights later shattered their fragile peace. Willa froze, her hand halfway to the pot where she had been preparing dinner, and her eyes flew to Yates. He was already moving, swinging his legs off the bed with a grace that spoke to how much strength he had regained. She shook her head sharply, motioning him to stay still, and moved to answer the door. She opened it only a crack, her body blocking the view inside. The man on her porch was Sheriff Tom Bradley, a decent enough man who had never gone out of his way to persecute her, but had never defended her either. He held his hat in his hands, his expression uncomfortable. "Miss Daniels," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his errand. "Sorry to bother you at this hour. Sheriff, what can I do for you?" She kept her voice steady, professional, giving nothing away. "I am looking for a wounded man, probably shot within the last week or so. You have not treated anyone like that, have you?" "I treat many people, Sheriff, as you know. Most of them do not advertise their ailments to the local law." "This is serious, Miss Daniels. The man is wanted for bank robbery and murder. If you are hiding him, you could hang right alongside him." Willa felt ice run through her veins, but she forced herself to meet the sheriff's eyes without flinching. "Are you accusing me of something, Sheriff, or asking me a question?" He shifted his weight, looking even more uncomfortable. "I am doing my job, madam. There are men in town from Miles City, men working for the bank, and they are convinced this fellow made it to Fort Benton. They have been asking around, and your name came up." "My name always comes up when someone wants to find a scapegoat," she replied coolly. "But I assure you, Sheriff, I have no wounded outlaws hidden in my cabin. Now, if you would like to search the premises, you are welcome to do so, but I would appreciate it if you brought a proper warrant. Otherwise, I have dinner on the stove and would like to return to it before it burns." For a long moment, the sheriff studied her face. She could see him weighing his duty against his conscience, measuring the word of a woman the town mistrusted against the demands of powerful men from Miles City. Finally, he replaced his hat and took a step back. "That will not be necessary, Miss Daniels, but if you do hear anything or treat anyone matching that description, I would appreciate being notified, for your own safety as much as anything." "Of course, Sheriff. Good evening." She closed the door carefully, fighting the urge to slam it, and leaned against the wood with her eyes closed. Her whole body trembled with the aftermath of fear and false calm. Behind her, she heard Yates moving, and when she opened her eyes, he was standing beside his horse, his gun belt strapped on, his expression grim. "I need to go," he said quietly. "Tonight, before they come back with men who will not be put off as easily as the sheriff. You are not ready. Another few days and you will be strong enough. But if you ride now, you could still tear something internal, could start bleeding again, could pass out and fall from your horse. Better that than bringing a mob down on your head." He moved toward her, cupping her face in his hands with surprising gentleness. "You have given me a chance at life, Willa. I will not repay that by getting you killed." She reached up, covering his hands with her own, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steadiness of his pulse. In the week he had been under her care, something had grown between them, something neither had acknowledged but both had felt. It lived in the lingering glances, the careful touches, the conversations that lasted long into the night. It lived in the way her heart lifted when he smiled, in the way he watched her move through the cabin as though she were something precious and rare. "If you go now, you will not make it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And I will have saved you for nothing. If I stay, I put you in danger, and I would rather die than do that." His thumbs stroked her cheeks, his eyes searching hers. "In another life, in another world where I was not a wanted man and you were not alone against a town's fear, I would stay. God help me, Willa, I would stay forever if you would have me. But in this life, in this world, the best thing I can do for you is leave." The tears came then, hot and bitter, and she did not try to stop them. "You do not get to make that choice for me, Yates Lawson. I have spent my whole life having other people decide what is best for me, what I should do, how I should live. I will not let you do the same, no matter how noble your intentions." "Then what would you have me do?" The question was raw, desperate, and she could hear in it the same war being fought in her own heart. "I would have you trust me," she said. "Trust that I know the risks and choose to take them. Trust that saving you was not just duty but desire, that keeping you alive matters to me beyond the simple fact of your survival." She took a shaking breath. "I would have you stay, Yates. Stay until you are truly healed. Stay until we figure out how to clear your name, or at least how to get you somewhere safe. Stay because the thought of you riding out into the night, wounded and alone, tears at my heart in ways I cannot fully explain." He pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her carefully, mindful of his healing wound, and she pressed her face against his chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart. This was foolishness, she knew. This was risking everything for a man she had known barely a week, a man with a price on his head and danger following in his wake. But when had wisdom ever kept her warm at night? When had caution ever filled the empty spaces inside her? "I will stay," he murmured against her hair. "But we need a plan, Willa. We cannot just wait for them to come back with enough men to force the issue." She pulled back, wiping her eyes, her mind already racing through possibilities. "You said your brothers are hiding somewhere nearby, within a day's ride, probably closer. We had a meeting place arranged if we got separated, an old line shack on the north range of what used to be our family's land. They should be there or near it. Then we need to get word to them, let them know you are alive and where you are. And we need to figure out who shot you and why, because if it was not the law, then someone else is looking for you, someone with their own reasons." "The banker's men," Yates said grimly. "Frank Hutchins does not want us arrested. He wants us dead before we can tell anyone about the fraudulent loans and stolen deeds. A trial would mean questions, evidence, maybe even an investigation into his practices. But 3 dead outlaws. That is just justice served as far as most people would see it." "Then we need to expose him," Willa said, the plan forming even as she spoke. "We need proof of what he has done, evidence that would hold up even after your deaths, evidence that would make people question the story they have been told." "That is easier said than done. Hutchins keeps his records locked up tight, and he has enough bought lawmen to make getting to them near impossible. Maybe for you and your brothers, riding in with guns blazing. But no one pays attention to a woman, especially one already on the margins of society. No one watches what the outcast healer does or where she goes." Yates stared at her, understanding and horror warring on his face. "No, absolutely not. I will not put you in that kind of danger. You already have simply by being here," she pointed out. "At least this way the danger serves a purpose beyond just keeping you hidden. This way, we have a chance of ending this without anyone else getting killed." They argued late into the night, Yates listing every possible thing that could go wrong, Willa countering each objection with stubborn determination. Finally, exhausted and recognizing the immovability of her resolve, he relented. They would send word to his brothers. They would gather evidence against Hutchins, and they would do it together or not at all. The next morning, Willa rode into Fort Benton with a list of supplies she needed and a plan that terrified her. She went first to the telegraph office, sending a carefully worded message to the land office in Miles City, requesting information about ranch foreclosures, claiming she was considering purchasing property and wanted to research the legal history. Then she visited the general store, the bank, and the saloon, listening to conversations, gathering gossip, piecing together a picture of Frank Hutchins and his operations. What she learned chilled her blood. The banker had indeed been systematically acquiring land throughout Montana Territory, foreclosing on properties for debts that materialized out of nowhere, backed by paperwork that looked official but could not be verified. Several ranchers had tried to fight back legally, only to find themselves facing ruined credit and threats of violence. 2 families had packed up and left rather than risk confrontation. Others had simply vanished, their land passing to Hutchins's control without explanation. The law, such as it was, seemed either complicit or powerless. Sheriff Bradley tried to maintain order within Fort Benton, but his jurisdiction ended at the town limits, and Hutchins's influence reached far beyond. The territorial governor was hundreds of miles away and notoriously difficult to reach. Justice, Willa realized, would have to be taken rather than given. She returned to her cabin as the sun set, her basket filled with supplies and her mind filled with dark knowledge. Yates met her at the door, his expression tense with worry that eased only slightly when he saw her unharmed. "Anything?" he asked as she unpacked her purchases. "A great deal," she replied, and proceeded to share everything she had learned. As she spoke, his face grew grim, confirming suspicions, adding details of his own. By the time she finished, full dark had fallen and a plan had begun to take shape between them. "My brothers need to hear this," Yates said. "If we are going to take on Hutchins, we need to do it together and we need to do it right." "Then we get them here," Willa decided. "Tomorrow night after dark. No one watches this cabin after sunset, too afraid of what might happen if they get too close to the witch's house after dark." She smiled without humor. "We might as well use their fear to our advantage." Yates reached out, taking her hand, his expression serious. "Are you sure about this, Willa? Once we start down this path, there is no going back. Your life here, whatever piece you have managed to carve out, it will all be at risk." She looked around her cabin at the herbs hanging from the rafters, the bed where she had saved countless lives, the walls that had sheltered her loneliness for so many years. What did she have to lose, really? The grudging tolerance of people who feared her, the privilege of living on society's edge, needed but never welcomed. "I stopped being sure about anything the moment you rode into my yard bleeding and unconscious," she said honestly. "But I am certain that doing nothing is not an option, not for you, not for the families Hutchins has destroyed, and not for me. I have spent my entire life being safe, Yates, and all it has brought me is isolation. Maybe it is time I took a risk on something that matters." He pulled her close, kissing her forehead with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "You matter," he said softly. "More than you know, more than I have words to explain. And when this is over, when we have settled things with Hutchins and cleared my name, I am going to spend a very long time showing you exactly how much." She tilted her face up, meeting his eyes, seeing in them a promise that went beyond gratitude or circumstance. "Is that so, Mr. Lawson?" "That is so, Miss Daniels," he confirmed. And then he was kissing her properly, his lips claiming hers with a passion that had been building between them since the first moment their eyes met. She responded with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his despite the need for caution around his wound. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Willa felt as though the world had shifted again, locking into a new configuration that included this man in ways she had never imagined possible. Whatever came next, whatever dangers they would face them together. And that knowledge, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, felt more right than anything in her life ever had. Getting word to Yates's brothers proved easier than expected. His horse, that faithful bay, knew the way to the line shack and carried Yates's message without hesitation. 2 days later, as the sun set over Fort Benton, 2 riders approached Willa's cabin with the caution of men who lived on the run, but the determination of those who refused to abandon family. Cole Lawson was built like his older brother but leaner, with the same green eyes and a quick smile that suggested an optimism Willa suspected the circumstances of his life did not warrant. James was darker, quieter, with a watchful quality that spoke of hard lessons learned young. Both treated Willa with a courtesy that surprised her, thanking her for saving their brother with a sincerity that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "He told us what you are planning," Cole said after the initial greetings and explanations. They sat around Willa's small table, speaking in low voices despite the isolation of the cabin. "I will not lie and say I like the idea of putting you in danger, Miss Daniels, but I will say we are grateful for the help. I am not doing this entirely for you," Willa admitted. "Hutchins represents everything wrong with how power works in this territory. Men like him take what they want and destroy anyone who stands in their way, and the law does nothing because he has enough money to make himself untouchable. If we can expose him, maybe it changes something. Maybe it gives others the courage to stand up to similar injustices. Or maybe we all end up dead," James said flatly, though without accusation. "We need to be clear-eyed about the risks, Miss Daniels. Hutchins has killed before, and he will kill again if he thinks we are a threat. Which is why we need evidence strong enough that killing us would not matter," Yates interjected. "Evidence we can get to the territorial governor, to newspapers, to enough people that Hutchins cannot silence everyone." They spent hours planning, arguing, refining their approach. Willa would travel to Miles City under the pretense of purchasing medical supplies only available in the larger town. While there, she would attempt to access land records, talk to families affected by Hutchins's fraud, gather the kind of testimonies and documentation that could not be easily dismissed. The Lawson brothers would scout the bank itself, looking for weaknesses, opportunities, a way to access Hutchins's private records if public documentation proved insufficient. It was dangerous, complicated, and relied on a dozen things going right when experience suggested things usually went wrong. But it was a plan, and plans gave hope, and hope was the only currency any of them had in abundance. Willa left for Miles City 3 days later, riding the gentle mare she kept for such trips, her saddlebags filled with legitimate business to mask her true purpose. Yates wanted to come with her, his protective instincts warring with the knowledge that his presence would only endanger them both. In the end, he let her go with nothing more than a fierce kiss and a promise that he would be there when she returned. Miles City was larger than Fort Benton, rougher around the edges, the kind of place where questions were not asked as long as money changed hands. Willa found lodging in a boarding house run by a widow who cared more about payment than propriety, and spent her first day simply walking the streets, getting the lay of the land, listening to the rhythm of the town. The bank dominated the main street, an imposing brick building that announced Hutchins's wealth and power to anyone who passed. Willa walked by it twice, noting the guards at the door, the expensive fixtures visible through the windows, the steady stream of nervous-looking people entering and leaving. This was the heart of the operation, she realized. This was where the fraud originated and where the evidence would be kept. But accessing the bank directly was impossible for someone like her. She needed another way in, another angle. She found it in the land office, where a tired clerk proved surprisingly willing to talk once she claimed to be researching property purchases. He pulled records at her request, showed her filings and deeds, and confirmed what she already suspected. The papers related to Hutchins's foreclosures were technically legal but based on loans that appeared out of nowhere, with terms no reasonable rancher would accept. "It is funny," the clerk said as he refiled the documents. "These ranchers, they would have had to borrow at rates that would bankrupt them in a year, and yet most of them had been working their land successfully for decades before Hutchins came along. Makes you wonder, does it not?" "It does," Willa agreed carefully. "Has anyone investigated?" The clerk laughed without humor. "Investigate Frank Hutchins. Lady, the man owns half the law in this territory and most of the politicians too. Anyone who asks too many questions finds themselves facing their own legal troubles real quick. We just file the papers and try not to think too hard about where they came from." Willa spent 2 more days in Miles City, talking to families who had lost their ranches, listening to stories of threats and violence, of mysterious debts and foreclosures that came without warning. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle, another thread to the web of corruption Hutchins had woven. And each person she spoke to carried the same defeated acceptance that nothing would change, because nothing ever changed when powerful men decided to take what they wanted. But Willa also heard whispers of the Lawson brothers, of 3 men who had struck back, who had taken from Hutchins what he had taken from others. Some people spoke of them with fear, painting them as dangerous criminals. Others, particularly those who had lost everything to the bankers' greed, spoke of them with something approaching hope, as though their very existence proved that resistance was possible. She gathered what evidence she could, copied records the clerk allowed her to see, collected testimonies from people willing to speak if promised anonymity. It was not enough, not nearly enough to bring down someone as entrenched as Hutchins, but it was a start. And sometimes, she reminded herself, a start was all you needed to build momentum. Willa returned to Fort Benton a week after leaving, exhausted but triumphant, her saddlebags heavy with documentation and her mind full of plans. She found Yates pacing her cabin like a caged animal, his relief at her safe return evident in the way he pulled her into his arms and held her as though afraid she might disappear. "I was going crazy," he admitted against her hair. "Every day you were gone felt like a year. I kept thinking of all the things that could go wrong, all the ways Hutchins could hurt you, and I hated myself for letting you go alone." "I was never alone," she reminded him, pulling back to look at his face. "I carried you with me every moment, the knowledge that you were here waiting, that I had something to come back to beyond just survival. That made all the difference, Yates." She shared what she had learned, laying out the evidence like cards in a poker game, showing the hand they now held. It was not perfect, but it was substantial, enough to raise serious questions about Hutchins's business practices if brought to the right people in the right way. "The territorial governor is our best bet," Cole said after examining the documents. "He is no saint, but he is not in Hutchins's pocket either, and he has been making noise about cleaning up corruption. If we can get this to him with enough fanfare that he cannot ignore it, he might actually investigate." "The newspapers, too," Willa added. "I spoke to a journalist in Miles City who has been trying to expose Hutchins for years. If we give him this evidence along with your testimonies about why you robbed the bank, it changes the narrative from dangerous outlaws to desperate men fighting corruption. It is still a gamble, James pointed out. Hutchins could kill us all before any of this sees the light of day. Life is a gamble, Yates said, looking at Willa with an expression that made her heart skip. And sometimes the prize is worth the risk. They spent the next week preparing their case, writing statements, organizing evidence, planning the logistics of delivering their information to the governor and the press simultaneously. Willa wrote passionately about the family she had met, the lives destroyed by Hutchins's greed, the system that protected power while punishing those who resisted. The Lawson brothers added their own stories, their father's death, the burning of their ranch, their decision to fight back when the law offered no protection. It was during this time, in the long evening hours when work gave way to rest, that Willa and Yates grew closer in ways that transcended the crisis bringing them together. They talked about the future, tentative at first, then with increasing confidence. They spoke of what they might build together once this was over, once his name was cleared and her reputation rebuilt. "I want to see you practice your healing without fear," Yates told her one night as they sat by the fire, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "I want to watch you walk through town with your head high, knowing you are valued and respected, not just tolerated." "I want you to reclaim your family's land," she replied, her fingers tracing patterns on his arm. "I want to stand beside you as you rebuild what was taken, as you create something good and lasting from all this pain." "Stand beside me," he repeated, pulling back to look at her face. "Is that how you see us, Willa? Just standing beside each other?" She met his eyes, seeing in them the question he was not quite asking, feeling in her own heart the answer that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "I see us however we choose to be, Yates. But if I am being honest, I see us as more than just allies or friends. I see us as partners in every sense of the word, building a life together that neither of us could build alone." "Marry me," he said, the words tumbling out with an urgency that suggested they had been building inside him for days. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few weeks, and I know I have no right to ask you to tie your life to a wanted man with an uncertain future. But Willa, I love you. I think I started loving you the moment I woke up and saw you sitting beside my bed, exhausted and beautiful and more brave than anyone I have ever known. Marry me, and whatever comes next, we face it together." She should have said no. Should have pointed out all the very reasonable objections, the complications, the impossibilities. Should have protected herself from the inevitable heartbreak that came from wanting too much too fast. But when she looked at Yates, at the hope and love and determination in his eyes, she found she did not want to be reasonable. She wanted to be reckless, wanted to reach for happiness even if it proved fleeting, wanted to claim this feeling that had grown between them and name it for what it was. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Yates Lawson, wanted man and former cowboy and the best thing that ever stumbled into my life. Yes, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, a kiss that promised everything and asked for nothing except her willing participation. And when they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing with the joy of it, Willa felt as though she had been living in shadow her entire life and had finally stepped into the sun. They married 3 days later in her cabin, with Cole and James as witnesses, and no official sanction beyond their spoken promises. Willa wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton she had made herself, and Yates stood beside her in clean clothes borrowed from his brothers, his green eyes never leaving her face as they exchanged vows. There was no minister, no church, no community to celebrate with them. But there was love, fierce and undeniable, and commitment that went deeper than any words or rituals could convey. That night, they consummated their marriage with a tenderness that honored Yates's still healing wound, but did not diminish the passion between them. Willa had never lain with a man before, had never expected to given her circumstances, but with Yates, everything felt natural and right. He treated her like something precious, taking his time, ensuring her pleasure matched his own, and when they finally joined together, she felt complete in a way she had not known she was incomplete. "I love you," he whispered against her skin as they lay tangled together afterward, the moonlight streaming through her window painting them in silver. "I will spend every day of the rest of my life proving that to you." "I love you too," she replied, tears of happiness slipping down her cheeks. "And I will spend every day of mine healing whatever wounds this world inflicts on you, whether they are physical or otherwise." But their happiness, profound as it was, existed in a bubble that could not last. Reality intruded 5 days after their marriage in the form of riders approaching the cabin in the pre-dawn darkness. Yates woke instantly, his instincts honed by months of being hunted, and had his gun in hand before Willa fully opened her eyes. "Get dressed," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the warmth it had held the night before. "We have company." She dressed quickly, her heart hammering, while Yates woke his brothers, who had been sleeping in the small barn she used for her animals. By the time the riders reached the cabin, all 3 Lawson brothers were armed and positioned, ready for whatever came next. But the knock on the door, when it came, was not the violent assault they expected. It was measured, almost polite, and followed by a familiar voice. "Miss Daniels." "It is Sheriff Bradley. I need to speak with you, please." Willa exchanged glances with Yates, who nodded reluctantly, then positioned himself beside the door, hidden from view but ready to act. She opened it a crack, just as she had the last time the sheriff came calling, and found him standing on her porch with 3 other men. "Sheriff," she acknowledged, keeping her voice neutral. "More questions about wounded outlaws. I am afraid it is more serious than that this time, Miss Daniels." His expression was grim, unhappy, and she saw genuine regret in his eyes. "I have a warrant for your arrest. You are accused of harboring a known criminal, aiding and abetting the Lawson gang, and conspiracy to commit robbery." The words hit her like physical blows, even though some part of her had known this moment would come. "On whose authority?" Judge Morrison in Miles City. "The complaint was filed by Frank Hutchins himself, claiming he has evidence you have been working with the Lawsons to target his bank." Of course, Hutchins had learned of their investigation. Of course, he had moved to neutralize the threat before they could expose him. Willa felt her carefully constructed plan crumbling around her, felt the weight of her choices settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. "I am a healer, Sheriff, not a criminal, and I resent the accusation that I would conspire with anyone to commit robbery." "Then you will have a chance to prove that in court," the sheriff said, though he sounded far from convinced. "But I have a legal warrant, Miss Daniels, and I am duty-bound to serve it. Please do not make this harder than it needs to be." For a moment, Willa considered her options. She could let Yates and his brothers fight, could let this confrontation turn violent and bloody. But that would only confirm Hutchins's narrative, would only prove to everyone that she was indeed a criminal who deserved their fear and condemnation. And it would almost certainly end with good men dead on both sides. Or she could go peacefully, could trust that the evidence they had gathered would eventually clear her name, could believe that justice, however delayed, might still prevail. It was a gamble, perhaps the biggest of her life, but was it not worth taking if it meant avoiding more violence? "I will come with you, Sheriff," she said, making her decision. "But I want your word that you will treat me fairly and that I will have a chance to present my case in court." "You have my word, Miss Daniels," he replied, relief evident in his voice. "And for what it is worth, I hope you can prove your innocence." She started to turn to gather her things when Yates stepped into view, his gun trained on the sheriff with steady hands. "She is not going anywhere with you." "Yates Lawson," the sheriff said, his hand moving toward his own weapon. "I had heard you were in the area. You are under arrest for bank robbery and murder." "I did not murder anyone, and the robbery was recovering stolen property. But that does not matter now, does it? You have your orders from Hutchins, and you will follow them whether they are just or not." "Stand down, Lawson. I do not want to shoot you, but I will if I have to." "Yates, no," Willa said urgently, moving between him and the sheriff despite the danger. "This is not the way. If you shoot a lawman, even in my defense, they will hang you without a trial. Let me go, trust me, and trust that the truth will come out. I cannot let them take you." His voice broke on the words, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "I just found you, Willa. I cannot lose you now." "You will not lose me," she promised, reaching up to cup his face, heedless of the watching men. "But if you fight now, you will lose everything, including any chance we have of exposing Hutchins. Please, my love, trust me to handle this." The standoff lasted an eternity measured in heartbeats. Yates's gun unwavering, the sheriff's hand on his holster, Willa caught between them, praying that love would prove stronger than violence. Finally, slowly, Yates lowered his weapon, the surrender visible in every line of his body. "If anything happens to her," he said quietly, his eyes locked on the sheriff's, "if Hutchins so much as threatens her, there will be nowhere in this territory you can hide from me. Do you understand?" "I understand," Sheriff Bradley said, "and I will do my best to ensure her safety." "You have my word on that as well." Willa gathered a few essentials, all too aware of the guns trained on her husband and his brothers, all too conscious that any wrong move could turn this fragile peace into a bloodbath. She kissed Yates one last time, putting everything she felt into it, then followed the sheriff to his horse. As they rode away from the cabin, she looked back once to see Yates standing in the doorway, his brothers beside him, all three watching her disappear into the dawn. She committed the image to memory, holding on to it like a talisman, a reminder of what she was fighting for and what she would return to when this was over. The jail in Fort Benton was a small, crude building that smelled of unwashed bodies and despair. Willa's cell was barely large enough for the narrow cot and chamber pot it contained, and the single window set high in the wall let in more cold than light. Sheriff Bradley apologized as he locked her in, promised again to do what he could, then left her alone with her thoughts and her fear. Time moved strangely in that cell. Sometimes hours felt like minutes, other times minutes stretched into eternities. Willa occupied herself by mentally cataloging herbs and their uses, by planning how she would present her defense, by thinking about Yates and praying he would not do anything reckless in his desperation to free her. She received no visitors, no word from the outside world. The deputy who brought her meals would not answer her questions, and the sheriff was conveniently absent whenever she called for him. It felt like a deliberate strategy, cutting her off from information and support, keeping her isolated and vulnerable. On the fourth day of her imprisonment, the cell door opened to admit not the sheriff, but a well-dressed man she recognized from her time in Miles City. Frank Hutchins himself stood before her, his smile cold and predatory, his eyes assessing her like a buyer evaluating livestock. "Miss Daniels," he said pleasantly, as though they were meeting at a social function rather than in a jail cell. "Or should I say Mrs. Lawson? Yes, I know about your little marriage to the outlaw. My sources in Fort Benton are quite thorough." Willa said nothing, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. She simply stared at him, channeling every ounce of the dignity her grandmother had taught her, refusing to be cowed by his wealth or power. "You have been causing me quite a bit of trouble," Hutchins continued, unperturbed by her silence. "Asking questions in Miles City, gathering evidence, conspiring with criminals. That is a lot of effort to go through for a man you barely know." "I know him well enough," she said finally, her voice steady. "And I know you too, Mr. Hutchins. I know what you have done to the ranchers in this territory, the families you have destroyed, the lives you have ruined in pursuit of profit. Did you really think no one would ever stand up to you?" "People stand up to me all the time," he replied with a shrug. "And then they realize the futility of it and either fall in line or disappear. You are not special, Miss Daniels, despite what your outlaw lover may have told you. Maybe not. But I do not need to be special to know right from wrong, and what you have done is wrong in every way that matters." Hutchins studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "I came here to make you an offer, though I am beginning to think you are too stubborn to accept it. Here is the deal. You testify against the Lawson brothers, tell the court they coerced you into helping them, and I will see to it that all charges against you are dropped. You can return to your little healing practice, and I will even throw in some money to help you rebuild your reputation. And if I refuse, then you hang alongside them when they are captured. Make no mistake, Miss Daniels, I will find the Lawson brothers, and when I do, they will die. The only question is whether you die with them or live to heal another day." She laughed, surprising both herself and Hutchins. "You really do not understand, do you? You think everyone operates the way you do, that principles and loyalty are just commodities to be bought and sold. But some things matter more than survival, Mr. Hutchins. Some things are worth dying for. And if exposing your corruption and protecting the man I love means I hang, then I will meet death with a clear conscience, which is more than you will ever be able to say." His pleasant mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold fury beneath. "You are a fool," he said flatly. "And you will die a fool's death. I will make sure of it." He left without another word, the cell door clanging shut behind him with a finality that echoed in Willa's bones. She sat down on her cot, her hands shaking now that the confrontation was over, and allowed herself a moment of fear. She had just sealed her fate, had chosen her husband and her principles over her life, and there was no taking it back now. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, she felt something else too: pride. She had not broken, had not given Hutchins what he wanted, had proven to herself that she was stronger than she knew. Whatever came next, she would face it knowing she had been true to herself and to the people she loved. What came next was salvation from an unexpected quarter. 2 days after Hutchins's visit, Willa woke to shouting outside her cell and the sound of breaking wood. She scrambled to the window, standing on her cot to peer through the bars, and saw a sight that made her heart leap. Yates, Cole, and James Lawson riding through Fort Benton in broad daylight, accompanied by a dozen armed men and a person in a suit who looked distinctly official. The cell door burst open moments later, and Sheriff Bradley stood there with his keys, his expression sheepish. "Seems there has been a misunderstanding, Miss Daniels. You are free to go." "A misunderstanding," she repeated, not quite believing it. "The territorial governor himself rode in this morning with an order for your release. Turns out the evidence you and the Lawsons gathered was pretty convincing, and he had a few federal marshals look into Hutchins's banking practices. Judge Morrison's warrant was issued under false pretenses, and you should never have been arrested." Willa stepped out of the cell on shaking legs, following the sheriff through the building to the front door. She emerged into brilliant autumn sunlight to find Yates dismounting and running toward her, catching her up in his arms and spinning her around despite the pain it must have caused his barely healed wound. "You did it," he said, laughing and crying at the same time. "You brilliant, brave woman, you actually did it." "We did it," she corrected, holding him tight. "All of us together." The man in the suit approached, introducing himself as Governor Preston's representative. He explained that the evidence they had compiled, combined with testimonies gathered by federal investigators, had been enough to open a full inquiry into Frank Hutchins's banking practices. Arrest warrants had been issued, assets frozen, and several corrupt officials, including Judge Morrison, had been removed from their positions pending trial. "The governor wanted me to personally apologize for what you have endured," the representative said, "and to assure you that the Lawson brothers will not face charges for the bank robberies, given the extenuating circumstances. In fact, the governor is recommending they receive commendations for exposing the corruption." It was almost too much to process, too much to believe after days of despair. Willa looked around at the gathered crowd, at the townspeople who had shunned her, watching this spectacle with varying expressions of shock, confusion, and grudging respect. She saw Samuel Porter, the man whose life she had saved and whose rescue had started this entire chain of events. He was smiling at her, actually smiling, and when their eyes met, he nodded his gratitude. "What happens now?" she asked, looking up at Yates. "Now we go home," he said. "To your cabin, to our life, to whatever future we want to build. The governor is returning our family's land. All the ranches Hutchins stole are being restored to their rightful owners. We have a chance to start over, Willa. We have a chance to do this right." They rode back to the cabin together, all three brothers and Willa, leaving the town and its whispers behind. The autumn air was crisp and clean, promising winter but not threatening it yet, and the Montana landscape spread around them in shades of gold and amber. Willa had never felt so light, so unburdened, as though years of weight had been lifted from her shoulders in a single morning. That night, they celebrated properly, cooking a feast from Willa's stores and the supplies the brothers had brought, sharing stories and laughter long into the darkness. Cole and James announced they would be leaving in a few days to begin rebuilding the family ranch, and they invited Yates and Willa to join them when they were ready. "But no rush," Cole said with a knowing grin. "Newlyweds deserve some time alone, especially after everything you have been through." After his brothers retired to the barn, Yates and Willa sat by the fire, content in the silence that comes from being completely understood. He held her hand, his thumb tracing lazy circles on her palm, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, breathing in his scent, feeling his heartbeat against her cheek. "I was so afraid," he admitted quietly. "When they took you, when I could not protect you, I thought I would lose my mind. Every minute you were in that cell felt like dying." "I was afraid too," she confessed. "But I was never afraid you would not come for me. I knew, somehow, that we would find our way back to each other. That is what love does, I think. It gives you faith when circumstances counsel despair." He tilted her face up, kissing her with a sweetness that made her heart ache. "I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to be that afraid again. I am going to build you a home where you can heal people without fear, where your skills are celebrated instead of condemned. I am going to give you the life you deserve, Willa, or die trying. All I need is you," she said simply. "Everything else is just details." They made love that night with a desperate urgency born of separation and fear overcome, reassuring each other through touch and whispered words that they were real. They were together. They were safe. And in the aftermath, tangled together in Willa's narrow bed, They spoke of the future with a confidence that had been impossible before. "How many children do you want?" Yates asked, his hand resting on her flat stomach as though he could already imagine it rounded with life. "At least 3, Willa said, surprising herself with the certainty. She had never allowed herself to dream of children, assuming her path would be walked alone. But now, with Yates, everything seemed possible. A house full of loud, healthy babies who grow up knowing they are loved. 3 sounds good, he agreed. And we will teach them everything, your healing arts and my ranching, grandmother Rose's wisdom and my father's integrity. They will be good people, Willa. They will make this territory better just by existing in it." She turned in his arms, kissing him slowly, pouring all her hope and love into the gesture. "They will be extraordinary because they will be ours." The weeks that followed were a blur of activity and adjustment. Word of Willa's vindication spread quickly through Fort Benton, and the tide of public opinion shifted as dramatically as it had once turned against her. People who had crossed the street to avoid her now nodded greetings when she passed. The general store owner apologized for his rudeness and offered her credit if she needed it. Even the minister, who had once called her practices heretical, stopped by the cabin to express his relief at her release and to inquire, somewhat shamefacedly, whether she might have something for his rheumatism. Willa accepted their apologies with grace, though she could not quite forgive the ease with which they had condemned her, or the speed with which they now sought to benefit from her skills. But she also recognized that holding grudges served no one, and that building the life she wanted required letting go of past hurts. Yates proved invaluable during this transition, his presence beside her lending legitimacy to her position in town. People might still fear her methods, but they respected him as a man who had fought corruption and won, and his obvious devotion to her forced them to reconsider their assumptions. The outcast healer became, almost overnight, Mrs. Lawson, wife of a local hero, and if that was what it took for them to see her value, she would accept it. They traveled to the Lawson family ranch in early December, joining Cole and James in the work of rebuilding what Hutchins's men had destroyed. The house was gone, burned to the ground, but the barn still stood, and the land itself was rich and unspoiled, waiting for someone to love it back to life. They worked through the winter, all of them together, building not just a house but a home. Willa set up a proper healing room, with shelves for her herbs and a clean, bright space for treating patients. Yates designed the kitchen to her specifications, installing a large stove and ample counter space for preparing medicines. Cole and James built their own cabins nearby, close enough for family but far enough for privacy. By spring, the ranch was functional again, and by summer, it was thriving. They rang cattle, bred horses, and opened their doors to anyone who needed healing or honest work. Word spread that the Lawson Ranch was a place where justice mattered, and people were judged by their character rather than their circumstances. Drifters found jobs, families displaced by Hutchins's schemes found new starts, and Willa's healing practice grew beyond anything she had imagined possible. She had patients from 3 counties now, people willing to travel days to see the healer who had defied a corrupt banker and lived to tell about it. Some came for her medicines, others for her wisdom, but all left feeling heard and valued in ways the conventional doctors did not provide. Willa thrived in this environment, her skills expanding, her confidence growing, her sense of purpose deepening with each life she touched. And through it all, Yates was beside her, partner in every sense of the word. He supported her work, defended her methods, and loved her with a constancy that never wavered. They argued sometimes, both too strong-willed for perfect harmony, but they always found their way back to each other, always remembered that their love was bigger than any disagreement. In the spring of 1884, Willa discovered she was pregnant. She had been feeling off for weeks, certain symptoms suggesting what her mind was slow to accept, and when she finally acknowledged the truth, she felt a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She told Yates that evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over their land, and his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He whooped with delight, picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down with exaggerated care as though she were made of glass. "Are you sure? When? How are you feeling? Do you need anything? Should you be sitting down?" She laughed at his flustered concern, taking his face in her hands. "I am sure it will be late autumn. I feel wonderful, and I need you to stop panicking. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, my love. I think I can manage." "But you are not just any woman," he protested. "You are my woman, and this is our child, and I want everything to be perfect." "It will be," she assured him, "because we will face it together, just like we have faced everything else." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, Willa's healer's knowledge ensuring she took proper care of herself while continuing her work. She slowed down only when her body insisted, stubbornly maintaining her schedule until Yates and his brothers conspired to hide her medical bag and refuse to saddle her horse. "You can heal people after the baby comes," Yates said firmly when she protested. "Right now, your only job is to stay healthy and let someone take care of you for once." She grumbled about overprotective husbands and conspiracy among brothers, but secretly, she was touched by their concern. All three Lawson men treated her like precious cargo, competing to bring her treats and cushions, arguing over who got to help her with various tasks. It was overwhelming and wonderful in equal measure. Their son was born on a cold November night in 1884, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his displeasure at being evicted from his warm home. Yates was there through the entire labor, holding Willa's hand, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement even as he looked terrified by the whole process. When the midwife finally placed the baby in his arms, he stared down at the squalling infant with an expression of such wonder and love that Willa fell in love with him all over again. "What should we name him?" Yates asked, unable to tear his eyes from his son's face. "Matthew," Willa said without hesitation, "after your father, so he can grow up knowing the man whose courage and integrity inspired everything we have built here." Yates looked up at her then, tears streaming down his face, and nodded wordlessly. Matthew Lawson it was, first son of a healer and a cowboy who had dared to fight corruption and found love in the midst of chaos. Cole and James were utterly besotted with their nephew, competing for his attention, offering to help with every aspect of his care. The ranch became a haven of joy, baby laughter mixing with the sounds of cattle and horses, tiny footsteps eventually pattering across the porch where Willa had once sat alone imagining what companionship might feel like. Matthew was not quite 2 when Willa discovered she was pregnant again, and this time Yates handled the news with slightly less panic and slightly more confidence. Their daughter arrived in the summer of 1887, a tiny thing with her father's green eyes and her mother's determined chin. They named her Rose, after Willa's grandmother, ensuring that the woman who had taught her healing arts would never be forgotten. The years that followed were full in ways Willa had never imagined possible. She continued her healing work, training other women in the community who showed interest, passing on her grandmother's knowledge so it would not die with her. Yates expanded the ranch, buying adjoining land that came available, building a legacy for their children and the children their children would have. They faced challenges, of course. Droughts and harsh winters, illnesses and accidents, the ongoing prejudice of those who still viewed Willa's methods with suspicion. But they faced everything together, drawing strength from their love and their family, refusing to be beaten by circumstances. Cole married in 1888, bringing home a school teacher from Helena who shared his optimism and gentle nature. James followed suit 2 years later, choosing a widow with 3 children who needed a father as much as he needed a family. The ranch expanded to accommodate everyone, becoming a compound of sorts, multiple families working together toward common goals. Fort Benton changed too, slowly but perceptibly. The railroad brought new people and new ideas, diluting the old prejudices if not eliminating them entirely. Willa became a fixture in town, respected if not universally accepted, and her children grew up without the stigma she had carried all her life. They were simply the Lawson children, loved and valued, inheritors of a legacy built on courage and principle. In 1895, 13 years after Yates had ridden into her yard bleeding and unconscious, Willa stood on the porch of their ranch house watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of orange and gold. 4 children played in the yard now. Matthew at 10, Rose at 8, and twins Samuel and Grace at 4, named for the man whose healing had started everything and the quality Willa hoped would define their family. Yates came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood like that often, watching their children play, marveling at the life they had built from such desperate beginnings. "You ever think about how close we came to losing all this?" he asked quietly. "How if I had not made it to your cabin, or if you had not been able to save me, or if we had not been brave enough to fight Hutchins, none of this would exist." "I think about it sometimes," Willa admitted. "But mostly I think about how grateful I am that we did make it, that we did fight, that we built something beautiful out of what could have been tragedy. You told me once that my ways saved you, Yates, but the truth is, you saved me too. You saved me from a life of loneliness and fear, from believing I would always be an outcast, from thinking I did not deserve love and family, and all the ordinary blessings I had stopped dreaming about." He turned her in his arms, kissing her with the practiced ease of long familiarity, but also with the passion that had never faded between them. "We saved each other," he corrected. "And then we saved us. Best decision I ever made was riding toward your cabin instead of away from it. Best decision I ever made was opening my door to a wounded stranger and refusing to give up on him even when it would have been easier and safer." Their children's laughter interrupted the moment, Matthew calling for them to come settle a dispute about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. Willa and Yates exchanged amused glances and walked down to join their family, hands clasped, hearts full, grateful beyond words for the life they had fought so hard to claim. The town of Fort Benton, Montana Territory, had once cast out a healer for her unconventional ways. A wounded cowboy had told her those ways saved his life, and begged her to save their future together. And in doing so, they had proven that love and courage could overcome fear and prejudice, that justice could prevail against corruption, and that 2 people who refused to accept the limitations the world placed on them could build something extraordinary. Years later, when people asked Willa about her remarkable life, about how she went from outcast to respected healer, from alone to beloved, she always gave them the same answer. "I did what I have always done. I healed wounds, whether they were physical or emotional or social. And I was blessed to find a man who understood that healing takes many forms, and who was willing to stand beside me while we healed ourselves and our community." And when they asked Yates how he went from wanted outlaw to successful rancher, from fugitive to hero, he would smile and say, I had the good fortune to be saved by a woman who saw past what I was accused of being to who I truly was. And then, I spent every day of my life trying to be worthy of that gift. Their children grew up knowing their parents' story, understanding the courage it took to fight for justice and love in a world that often rewarded neither. Matthew became a lawyer, fighting corruption through legal means, carrying on his parents' legacy of standing up for the powerless. Rose became a doctor, blending her mother's healing wisdom with modern medical training, ensuring that grandmother's knowledge would live on in new forms. The twins found their own paths, Samuel as a teacher and Grace as a rancher, but all of them carried forward the principles their parents had instilled. That right matters more than expedience, that love requires courage, and that the outcast and the overlooked often have the most to teach us if we are brave enough to listen. Willa and Yates grew old together on their Montana ranch, surrounded by children and grandchildren, watching the territory they loved become a state, and the Wild West they had known gradually transform into something more settled and civilized. They never forgot the desperate days when their love was new and their future uncertain, when a wounded cowboy and an outcast healer took a chance on each other and changed both their lives forever. And when Willa finally passed, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, with Yates holding her hand just as he had held it through every crisis and celebration of their 56 years together, the entire community mourned. The church was packed for her funeral, filled with people she had healed, families she had helped, lives she had touched through her courage and skill. The minister, a different man than the one who had once condemned her, spoke of her legacy. Willa Lawson taught us that healing comes in many forms and from many sources. She taught us that the person we fear today might be the hero we celebrate tomorrow if we have the courage to look past our prejudices. She taught us that love and principle matter more than reputation or profit. And she taught us all, through her example, how to live with integrity even when integrity costs us everything. We are all better for having known her, and Fort Benton is a better place because she refused to give up on us even when we gave up on her. Yates followed his beloved wife 3 years later, his heart simply stopping one spring morning as he sat on the porch where they had shared so many sunsets. The doctor said it was his heart, weakened by age and that long-ago bullet wound, but his children knew better. Their father had died of a broken heart, unable to exist in a world without the woman who had saved him in every way a person can be saved. They buried him beside Willa on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, under the big Montana sky that had witnessed their love story. And if you visit that hill today, you can still see their markers, still read the words their children chose to commemorate their remarkable lives. Willa Daniels Lawson, healer, wife, mother. Her ways saved countless lives, including the one that mattered most. 1859–1937, Yates Matthew Lawson, rancher, husband, father. He saw worth where others saw threat and built a legacy on courage and love. 1858–1940, their story became legend in Montana, passed down through generations, inspiring others who found themselves cast out or condemned for being different. The healer and the cowboy who refused to accept the world's judgment, who fought corruption and prejudice, and won, who proved that love really could conquer all if you were brave enough to claim it. And on quiet evenings when the wind blows across the Montana plains, locals swear you can still hear echoes of laughter from that ranch house, still see shadows on the porch of two people who loved each other so completely that not even death could fully separate them. Because some love stories do not end when life does. Some love stories become part of the land itself, woven into the fabric of place and memory, reminding us all that courage and love and the willingness to stand for what is right can create miracles even in the hardest of times. The legacy Willa and Yates built lived on in their descendants, in the healing center established in Fort Benton bearing her name, in the scholarship fund for students pursuing medicine or law that he endowed, in the countless lives touched by their example. They had taken their pain and turned it into purpose, their isolation into community, their fear into faith. And in doing so, they had proven that one person's courage can change a community, that two people's love can transform a legacy, and that the outcast and the outlawed can become the founders of something beautiful and lasting if they refuse to surrender to the world's limited vision of what is possible. Their story reminds us still that healing takes many forms, that justice sometimes requires breaking unjust laws, and that love, real love, the kind that sees you completely and chooses you anyway, that kind of love is worth fighting for no matter the cost. The healer was outcast for her ways. The cowboy said her ways saved him. Together, they saved each other and built a future neither could have imagined alone. And that, in the end, is the greatest healing of all.